If you're building a SaaS app, a micro SaaS or a full SaaS, don't put all your code in one single file. I know most of the tutorials start that way, but that's not a production grade application. So stick with me. In this video, I'll show you how I'm setting up my first AI application and exactly dividing it in going from monolith to layers. For those of you joining me, I'm an ex senior product manager and I'm learning to be an AI engineer in public. I've decided not to wipe code and think about system design and architecture because that matters a lot. I'm building 6 apps, starting simple with API with inference and working all the way up to autonomous apps. This is app 1 called as GrowthMap. All the code and resources are free, and the link below in description. Subscribe and build alongside me. Why not have everything in a single main.py, right? What goes wrong? So the first thing is think about how the structure of your code looks like. You have your HTTP, your validations, your business logic, everything is tangled, right? So there is one change to your entire to your main.py introduces risk to your entire application. The file size is also doubling because every time you introduce code, it just becomes too unwieldy to read. You can't isolate and test. This is perhaps the most biggest one because we always code thinking that we'll never go back and maintain code, but maintenance of code becomes a huge what we call as tech debt if you can't start to clearly understand what's going on inside each file. And then the worst part is it's okay if you're like me, it's one person working on a code base, but most likely you'll have several people working on a single file. It just becomes too difficult to merge all the conflicts. How do you know which files they are touching, which methods there or functions they are touching? It just becomes impossible to maintain. And then the database connections gets opened everywhere, so many different connections. You don't have one single manager for database connections. So these are all some very good reasons why if you're building an app, don't put everything in a single file. So that then goes back to how would we actually set up a structure from a monolith to different layers. So I've done this in terms of thinking it in terms of layers. So the first layer is obviously the roots, and since I'm building it in Python, my main Python class is there just to create a fast API app, and it includes all the relevant routers in terms of, let's say this is a slash qualify start, that's one root. I need to just include that root, and then I'll split every single root into its specific subfolder. So I have qualifications as one folder. Under that I'm creating a root, and root for me is just this should handle all of HTTP connection failures, everything to do with HTTP should sit here, right? And then schemas is the next layer. For Pydantic, you need to have all the request and response validation sitting in one single place, because these classes, if you have a big app with several endpoints, it will start to become quite noisy if you put all of that in a single file. So it's much cleaner to have separate schemas. And then I'll have a service folder, which probably is the most important one because this is where all the interesting thing happens. So this is where our core business logic, right? So if I'm going to do a qualification for GrowthMap, the sequence of logic of first actually creating a new prospect and then creating a new user, so all of that logic flow actually sits in this file. And then my repository, not a surprise, it's where the SQL connections and the database layer gets handled. One very important thing I want to talk to you towards the end of this video of how I split, whether I pass connections or whether I pass or let my service uh, not pass the connections and let the connections instantiate. I'll show you the exact difference between the two and which I prefer doing. And then for any external calls, I have something called as a client, which manages the actually outbound HTTP requests that are not tied into my FastAPI routes. So how does this look like in practice? So in my setup, I have qualifications as a folder, and within qualifications, like we discussed, I have just initialized it so I can actually import this um, as these into my main. So if we start the flow, so I have my main, as I said, we're just having a single FastAPI instantiated, and all we're doing here is including a single router. At the moment I have just one route that I've defined, which is a qualifications router, and I have split that as qualifications is one core app, a set of logic or work that I'm doing. So I've split that into a folder called qualifications. Under that I have routes. So within my routes I now have a single route, and again the route just calls another service which actually handles the logic like we discussed, right? So the service is where all of my code, actual code runs. As you can see, because we need to define our Pydantic schemas, I'm also including the schema specific files as well here, which are defined in this separate file. So now going back to my service, the service is a bit long because I started working on the actual API calls, but pretty much if we follow through the main function that gets invoked, which is a starting point for our post endpoint, this is where as I said, I'm doing number 1, number 2, number 3, and then start doing different things. At some point, like example this one, is where I know I have to make a call to my client, right? So that's where we introduce our client call, which nicely handles specific outbound calls to data for SEO. So just to summarize, separation of concerns is the core concept that you should be taking away from this. All of our validations per business object or business type of work that you're doing will be included in your schemas. Anything that you're going to do for routes or HTTP, including HTTP specific errors, should be handled in your routes. All of your business logic will be in your service layer, and the routes which will become the starting point for your main.py. I want to also take a couple of minutes to show you a bit of a dilemma I was in, whether I should be passing from my service.py, whether I should be passing a connection every time. So who manages connections? Should connections be centrally managed by the business service, or should connections be individually created from every method? So originally, if I show you the previous version of this code, so previous version of my code did not have the connection, and what I was doing was individually, when it comes to repository, I was individually within every function, I was not passing the connection, and I was actually creating a I was doing with connect db connection as con every single function, and that is not really something you should be handing over to your database layer. And the reason is, every time you're passing the connection, you're recreating a connection object, it's one new connection that's created and closed, created and closed, created and closed. So if you think of my logic here, I'm creating a user, creating a connection, creating a user, closing the connection, creating a connection, creating a prospect, closing a connection, which starts to become really heavy and really unnecessary. So I think my biggest mistake and what I learned was, I don't think I should be doing that connection management down at a database layer. I need to be managing connections up here in my service layer. So I hope you follow along and don't make the same mistake as mine. And stay tuned for my next video. I'm going to be talking about the exact qualification flow that we are going to do, and in terms of what the post API endpoint it's going to accept and what it's going to return, and exact steps that happens in between. See you in the next one.